Hi, Beth.
I love seeing people's faces. I haven't been able to see people's faces at most of these events.
Well, I'm glad this is okay. I have not figured out the webinar format. That's for next year. One more thing to learn. Okay, I'm gonna, there's still a couple people coming in, but I am gonna start with an introduction so we can get going. Thank you everybody for coming. Welcome to Roundabout Books virtually, and I'm gonna just add people as they come in. We are thrilled to welcome Tina Ontiveros tonight, author of the new memoir, Rough House. Tina is a writer, a teacher, a bookseller based in Oregon. She was raised below the federal poverty line, living mostly with her single mother at the edge of the Oregon desert, but often with her constantly migrating dad in a small timber towns outside of around the Pacific Northwest. Tina completed her college education and began her writing and teaching careers while raising her children. As a writer and teacher, Tina's work explores class, generational hardship, and the social constructs that marginalize the poor in her memoir. Rough House was released by OSU Press at the end of September. It's on the 2020 Indie Next Great Read list and is number 3 on the PMBA nonfiction bestsellers list. So we're really thrilled to have you in our community, in and around our towns, and here on our event tonight. In Rough House, Tina follows her father, Loyd, as a logger, roaming across the timber and mill towns of the Pacific Northwest, living in trailers and shelters he builds for his family. Stuck in a lifelong migration between sobriety and chaos, he's forever starting over. As Loyd moves through his forested territory, he hurts and abandons his daughter countless times. But he also makes wonder, imagination, and grit into family values. Rough House speaks very plainly and certainly about the strength and joy that can be forged in struggle, affirming our shared humanity and the redemptive power of love. So we're really thrilled to have Tina here. As she starts talking, I'm going to put some links in the chat that you can follow up on her website and other information about Tina. Welcome. I thought maybe we would just start with a short reading, if you don't mind, and then we're just go back and forth conversation style, and we'll talk for about half an hour, and then feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those when we wind up our conversation. Thank you, Tina. Welcome.
Thank you, Cassie. You know, you were one of the first bookstores to write me and invite me for an event.
Really?
So
oh, wow. Good to
finally make it. Yeah. And yes, I will read something. And I was thinking, I think I might read 2 really short pieces because you had suggested a certain piece when we were corresponding, which I love. It's one of my favorites, so I know why you suggested it. But I realized that I had kind of been reading that piece kind of a lot lately. There might be people on this call. That's okay because I already made a plan. So I'm going to read that. I thought this would be fun. I'm going to read that short piece. And then I'm going to read a short piece from a little later in the book that relates to that piece. And I thought that might be kind of fun. So, but somehow my bookmark got moved. So let me find it here. And this is, I don't think there's a lot of setup you need to know for this piece. It is just a short little snippet from when my family lived together in a 15-foot trailer for most of my first 5 years. And we pulled this trailer around from town to town and just sort of parked it wherever my dad was logging, and that's where we lived, 4 of us in a 15-foot trailer. And then this is just a little piece from the beginning of the book when my mom finally convinced my dad, Loyd, to settle down in one place so my brother could go to school, my brother Jesse. So I think the only history you need to know here is that my mom had recently convinced Loyd to sell that 15-foot trailer and buy a 35-footer, which she referred to as the mansion. So Mom finally convinced Loyd to settle down in Clallam Bay, Washington before Jesse started first grade. Crown Zellerback was the second largest lumber company shaving the surface of the Pacific Northwest back then, and Loyd was lucky enough to get on their payroll. He was proud to be a company man, though it wouldn't last. For many years, I'd feel that pride linger a moment whenever I saw a white metal Crown Zellerback paper towel dispenser in a public bathroom. When we first got to Clallam Bay, we lived in the mansion. Before long, we sold it and rented a big double wide in a trailer park on a bluff looking down on the ocean. This was the kind of trailer that actually needs some furniture. It wasn't all built in. Sometimes when Mom wanted to make dinner in peace or go to the laundromat alone, Loyd would say, "You kids want to go on a wander?" He meant a walk on the beach. There was never a time we didn't want to go. I could have a bellyache and a fever, and I'd still go on a wander. We'd walk on that beach with Loyd as long as he'd let us, no matter how cold our faces or fierce the wind. I had a powder blue pea coat with polyester white fur lining that I thought was so pretty, though it had belonged to another girl before me. It wasn't even a little bit water resistant, but I didn't care. You know how sometimes you're listening to a song you love, and all you can think about is restarting that same song as soon as it's over? That's what it was like to walk on the beach with my dad. Loyd stopped often to stoop down and point things out along the shore. He'd gather seashells or bits of interesting flotsam, not just gather, consider. He might hold up a piece of broken shell and ask, "What's that look like to you, hun?" He was truly interested in my interpretation. He'd ask if I could imagine it as the head, foot, or body of one of his seashell creatures. He used a hot glue gun to put together shells and create silly figures, some on 2 legs, some on 4, 6, or 8. He'd add plastic googly eyes, then take them down to the tourist shop and sell them. Our beach walks were collecting missions to gather shells, driftwood, moss, and rocks for his critters. But it was about more than collecting. Loyd would hold up a piece of driftwood and ask us to look at the way the sea had shaped it. We discovered mermaids, dragons, wiener dogs. Driftwood can be anything, and Loyd never got tired of that idea. It's just plain wood, but also a tadpole, a giant's pointer finger, a long, skinny Ford pickup truck. He taught us to compare today's landscape with yesterday's, to observe the way the ocean kept on changing the lines of our walking. Nothing stronger than the power of the sea. Nothing's got more slow patience. Not the coastline with its craggy bluffs, not the mountains or the rivers or even the forest. I lived in a small body then, and when Loyd knelt down to talk to me, to show me the miracle of an unbroken sand dollar or newly forming inlet, he looked like a man at prayer. What I mean to say is that he made me feel like I deserved to take up space. From his moments of careful attention, I learned to expect some amount of worship from the world. From his violence, desperate apologies, and absences, I would discover that the same sparkling fires that fueled his creativity could burn out of control, leaving a landscape stripped of life. Loyd would hurt and fail me in 100 ways. But first he taught me to wonder, gave me love without condition, and moments where I felt holy. So that's the one that you mentioned, and that's from the beginning of the book. But then I've remembered that there's another short piece in the second half of the book that sort of relates back to that story. So this is after I lived with my dad for the summer. And we went back to my mom's for the school year, and my brother surprised me by telling me he decided he was going to go live with Loyd for the school year. And I knew I couldn't follow him. And so this is just kind of me learning to live without my brother. And my brother's name is Jesse. Life without Jesse was scary, but I also had a new freedom. I walked to school and home alone every day. Missy moved into Jesse's bedroom, so I had a room to myself. I'd always been more social than my brother. Now that I had my own room, I didn't mind inviting friends over. It was easier for me to flirt with boys when Jesse wasn't around. I didn't have to worry about him seeing me holding some boy's hand or hearing that I went to a party. I kissed a couple of boys, both friends I couldn't get excited about, even as the kisses happened. After school one day, I found myself walking with a beautiful skater. He just appeared beside me. I was pretty sure I could get excited about him. He had short dark hair, deep brown eyes, and there was something about his jawline that made me want to look at his face all the time. I was worried he'd catch me staring. I knew one of my friends had a crush on him, but I kept walking with him anyway. It was exciting to feel like I was being sneaky. We didn't talk much at school, but we started walking home together most days. I looked forward to it, and I think he did too, because we'd walk really slow. He liked to talk about things I'd never even thought about and found a little scary, like anarchy and the cure. I took it all to mean he was smarter than me. I was in a Madonna phase and thought the Like a Prayer video was sophisticated. I got the idea he thought that was too mainstream. I figured I was too, so I just soaked him up for as long as the walking lasted. We were almost to his house one day and he just stopped walking. It took me a couple of steps to realize it and turn back. He was looking at me in this way that made me want to squirm, like I was in trouble. Do you want to come in? I was pretty sure he didn't really like me. I worried about his opinion and knew that I probably wouldn't be able to tell him no if this headed where I thought it might, where I hoped it would. I wanted him to want me, but I also wanted him to like me, maybe even love me. He watched my face as I worked through it all in my mind. Don't worry, he said, I just want to show you something. What? Remember I told you about that tribe that can shrink human heads? Yeah, I got one, a real one. I didn't want to see a real shrunken head, but I did want to stay with him. I wanted him to think I was brave. And while the thought of following him down the stairs to his basement bedroom made me nervous, it also thrilled me. My body was already singing. His bedroom was dark and cool. He pushed play on his tape deck and Depeche Mode came on, Personal Jesus. He walked over to the dresser, lit incense, and picked up the shrunken head. There was a hole through it just behind its tiny ears, strung through with a piece of hemp cord like a necklace. The face looked like leather, and it had sparse, wiry hair the color of straw. I was pretty sure it was fake. He asked if I wanted to touch it. I said no. He asked if I wanted to sit. I said sure. I put my bag down and sat on the edge of his bed. He sat beside me, his thigh touching mine. I focused my eyes on the door. He turned toward me and almost touched his nose to my neck just behind my ear. Fear was replaced with something else, something entirely new, delivered on a shutter. He exhaled against my neck and it ran all the way down to my toes. I put my hand on his upper arm and it was hard. Skateboarding must have been good exercise because his leg was hard too, pushed up against me. I wanted to touch all of him. This was all new, but it was also familiar, ancient. I knew I could be smashed against his hard body again and again. I thought of the sea, slamming against the rocky cliff back in Clallam Bay, of the driftwood we gathered there, always shaped by the waves. How natural it all felt. I could be shaped too. I could learn about the cure and tribes that shrink people's heads. Whatever I thought, if I get to keep pressing myself against his body, I can be like driftwood. My mind snagged on that image and I was gone, standing on the beach in Clallam Bay as Loyd knelt in front of me, holding up a piece of driftwood and asking me to imagine all the things it could be, all the possibility. My body went still next to the beautiful boy because I could be hard too. I could be the one to do the shaping. I didn't say anything to him. I put my hand on his chest and stood up. Then I grabbed my bag and left. I walked up the stairs and into the fall sunshine, and I knew it was awkward and prude, but I just kept walking.
Thank you so much for that, Tina. I love that passage too. It's one of my favorites. I don't know if I told you in my email, but I was born 1 year after you. So all your references are very familiar to me. And so like just that passage about the cure, I was like, yes, of course. So it was really nice. You know, in that passage you just read, it was so telling of the rest of your book because the way you wrote, it was really about how childhood reverberates throughout the rest of your life. And so in that one moment, you had this visual back to the beach with your dad. And so I was just wondering, like, what brought you to that moment to decide, I'm going to write about my childhood? Was it something you were always doing? Was it like, we're going to, you know, set forth and do this now? Or
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it was ever a decision. I still haven't decided to do that. I mean, I think before I wrote it, it was writing me. Like, you know, I held it in my body. And in that sense, I've either been telling it my whole life or it's been telling me, right? And I think as I became more educated and financially stable, I was able to set down the shame that you carry when you're in poverty. You know, in America, we have almost a founding principle we live by, which is that you should always be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Mm-hmm. And because of this sort of bootstrap ethos that we live by, it's like such a deep part of our kind of national pride. Yeah. We automatically assign shame to people who are unable to do it. And obviously it doesn't make sense. Only so many people can, in capitalism, there always have to be people on the bottom, but that's just how it works. And so there's a shame that comes from the outside world when you live in poverty. And I think especially, I can't speak for any family but my own, but you know, my parents were generationally poor. Like this was poverty that had been in the family for generations. And so I think as I was able to, you know, get an education and become more financially stable, I was able to set that shame down. And that probably had something to do with sort of becoming free to speak. But I worked on it in like bits and different forms for over 10 years before I like sat down and wrote the manuscript that became Rough House. I think another motivation for me, I know, because you know, there's a difference between writing the book and publishing the book. So that's yeah, so that's why I wrote the book, or that's how I came to write the story. But as far as publishing it, a big motivation there was my niece. You know, I have 2 siblings, and only one of us has been unable to get out of poverty, which I think is pretty amazing that 2 of us did. I think that says a lot for my mom. So I have a sibling who has always lived below the federal poverty line, and she has kids. And so I have a niece who's now 16, but I could see when she was like 11, I began to really recognize the ways that she was carrying shame just as I had, just as her mother does. And, you know, for no reason other than being poor. And so I definitely felt sort of a calling or a responsibility to tell part of our family story for her, because I want her to recognize the joy and the beauty in that struggle, which she's in right now. And I wanted her to know that the story she's living right now will be something that gives her pride someday. Yeah. And I think that if she knows that now, she might be able to set that shame down much earlier than I did, you know? So she's definitely a big motivator.
That's great. No, that's great. You know, one of the questions I'd mentioned was there's a certain, and I love that you wrote this with your niece in mind, because there is a certain fierce like independence and freedom that comes with that too. And do you think that she felt like, or any reader reading this feels like maybe it's an opening to think about your circumstances in a way that's more positive? Or
I hope so. I hope so. You know, somebody asked me a question recently about how did I write it without anger? And I thought, you know, sure, yeah, when I was in my 20s, there were times I really held on to a lot of anger, but that's not interesting literature for me. And, you know, there's one thing to write a book to process something, which I think is a beautiful thing to do. But for me personally, if I'm going to publish it, my hope is that it's going to be something that can sort of communicate with people, you know, outside of space and time. Yeah. And a really angry book doesn't ever do that for me. And so I wanted it to just be more curious, you know, just kind of a curiosity, and to just sort of enter into it with a spirit of curiosity. I love the essay form. So I kind of wanted a memoir that sort of read like an essay, and that, you know, I'm not going to answer or solve any problems or answer any questions, but I'm just sort of going to muck around in it and find my way, you know? And so, and I think curiosity is a little joyful. So I hope so. I mean, yeah.
It's joyful. There's this line for anybody that hasn't read it yet. I love this description. The first time I saw the camp, which is where they went in the summer, I knew it was enchanted and dangerous, like entering a fairy kingdom. And it makes me think about childhood and the freedoms that we had, and everything was slightly dangerous. But I was wondering if you could speak to a moment about growing up in this community of loggers and people living this close to the land, and the lessons you took from that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say I grew up in a community of loggers, because like we migrated with a lot of other logging families in my first 5 years, but they were always changing. There weren't always the same people. And so it was, even though we were kind of always surrounded by other people, and I'd be running around with kids who I wouldn't remember their names, it was very much, we were very isolated, the four of us. So the only constant was the four of us. And then when my mom left my dad after a very violent episode, then every time I returned to him, it was that, like you just described, that re-entering the forest, like this re-entering of that sort of, and that allowed me in many ways to make Loyd a mythological kind of character in my mind, right? Because every time I was going back to him, I was coming back to the forest. Like, he never stayed in one place. He was feral. He was constantly moving. He would usually live in like abandoned trailers that he cleaned up, or shacks that he built, or like the camp that you're talking about was this huge tent we lived in, and like he was just squatting in the forest. Like, he didn't have permission to squat there. And that was in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, and just outside of Packwood, Washington was that camp. And so it was always, there was this sense of enchantment when I would come back to him. And I think that in many ways, you know, gave this beautiful and wild backdrop for my childhood stories. And I really wanted place to sort of be a character in the book. But I couldn't ever put myself in one place. We moved so much. It's hard to place yourself at any given time, but it was always the woods, right? So that allowed for that fairy tale quality. But I think it also allowed me as a child to process some of the trauma that we were experiencing, because, you know, I'm always returning to my dad in these sort of magical settings. And it had this, you know, I was probably giving it this fairy tale feeling. And that made some of the bad stuff kind of okay, because, you know, fairy tales always have darkness. They always have like danger, and they wouldn't work without that darkness. And so I think in many ways it allowed me to process a lot of that stuff in a child's mind. You know, adventure always comes with risk. So, but also, yeah, my dad had a way of really celebrating beauty through, you know, in nature, and teaching me to just be curious and wander. And so I don't necessarily, I'm not a person who thinks of like nature as a source of escape, which I think a lot of people do. And I think it's because I lived like that so much.
Yeah.
But I do think of it as, you know, like as a source of comfort, and that it allowed me to sort of find beauty in some very hard times.
Yeah. You kind of refer to this theme throughout your book, and you just mentioned it too, that meeting of the good and the bad. And in fact, the very first line of your book, you may not consider my dad a good man, but if you met him, you probably would have liked him. I was just wondering if you could take a moment to expand on this idea and what it means to be a good man. And do you think your feelings changed as you wrote the book about your father?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about that line, though, is that it wasn't always the first line. And, you know, I always tell my writing students, finish your you know, your story you're writing or whatever it is, and you're going to find the beginning at the end. And for me, I kind of came back and put that at the start, because I realized that was really the heart of the book, was like, I really want to interrogate this idea. I'm really interested in this idea of who is good.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do notice the ways that we have this habit of deciding who deserves our empathy. And I find that really curious. Like, you know, why do we need to ration that? You know, are we going to run out? I think we often feel like we have to challenge whether somebody deserves our empathy based on their actions. But I think that really only mostly impacts disenfranchised people, you know? And so like when you're poor, it's really easy to become known for the worst thing you ever do. And I feel like I've lived in the middle class long enough to have known men here who, you know, are addicts, mm-hmm. and who get violent, mm-hmm. and who do things that they wish they hadn't done, and aren't always able to love their children well, or their wives well, and women too. Mm-hmm. But I'm mostly speaking in terms of Loyd. But they are just called, you know, a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer. They're not called a deadbeat dad or a drunk or, you know, whatever. And I feel like poor people, we have these terms we will use only for poor people, you know, like tweaker, crack mom, welfare mom, that is, they exist only to assign only
Stigma or shame.
stigma and shame to those people. Yeah. And so I think that whole beginning line, you may not consider my dad a good man. It's just, for me, that's what I was curious about. I mean, I was honestly curious about that. Like, was my dad a good man?
Yeah.
But now it's, to me, the question is, are there any good people and bad people, you know?
I think you uncovered that so well in your book. You went through, I mean, pages of like stories that were up and down and good and bad and great impact on you and debilitating impact on you. And it's just so interesting to see somebody fully fleshed out in that way. It's very good. So my next question has to do with time.
Okay.
So you were born in 1976, and you saw a lot of change in how your mom was treated as a woman. And you have these scenes where you're talking about before your mom left, where the women had zero access to money and then were controlling the entirety of the money. How your dad controlled whether or not your mom could get the RH factor medicine that she needed for another pregnancy. Like, and honestly, it was very shocking to me. Like, I was just blown away, even though I grew up in the same time period. And so I was just wondering if you felt that shock as you were revisiting these stories, or how that kind of time period came to be.
Yeah, so I had always known about the RH factor thing because it ended up having very serious consequences later on. But I remember when I found out that, like, it was a conscious thing my dad had done, and I was shocked to hear. So I was born in 1976 in Orofino, Idaho, and my mom was found to have, the RH factor, which most women when they're pregnant are just automatically tested for, and it's a quick treatment to keep it from harming your child. But when she wanted that treatment, the hospital required her husband's signature. And my dad refused to give his signature because he had been raised Jehovah's Witness. And even though he didn't really practice, and his connection to the Kingdom Hall was very tenuous and up and down, it sort of always coincided with his sobriety and his AA attendance. He was not sober at that time, but he had very much been raised that you keep women in their place. Mm-hmm. And so he wouldn't sign this consent form so that she could get this blood product, which would have saved everyone a lot of heartache. Mm-hmm. And so she said, okay, fine. I'll get, a tubal so that I don't have any more children, because I was not RH incompatible with my mom. I was just triggering the response, so it would only impact future pregnancies. Right. And so she said, I'll just take a tubal so I can't have any more kids. And he refused to sign a consent form for that as well. So she was not allowed to have it. And I think it's really compelling to think about that, especially, and this is a conversation we're having today about how many of our own reproductive decisions do we get to make, right? and it's a real life example of like what happens when people start getting involved in your medical decisions. But yeah, he refused. And so she was unable to get either. And 6 years later, she got pregnant. And my little sister, her pregnancy with my sister was a nightmare. And she actually ended up like on the cover of the Oregonian. My sister and one other baby were like these babies that OHSU sort of, shepherded into life. But it was as my mom got closer to her due date, she had to stay in the hospital for these long periods of time and have blood transfusions like straight into her belly. And it was just this huge ordeal to shepherd my sister safely into the world because of that decision, And then, yeah, you're right. I mean, I watched my mom as a single mother navigate the world of men and try to keep her children safe and fed and housed. And it was, there were a lot of times that men with even just a tiny bit more power could have such a huge impact on our lives, particularly landlords, but people she worked with as well, So yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I remember just feeling it all the time as a kid.
Yeah, it seems really frightening, but also really telling of the late 70s and early 80s and how much things were changing in terms of gender at the time. Yeah. And it was interesting to grow up through that. So the next thing is place. So you have this quote about the Columbia River. Hold on, somebody's having trouble with their volume. I'm gonna try to help her unmute that. So you had this quote about the Columbia, which I thought was great. You said, "I've never known a river so wide and wondered why it couldn't manage to make the land it touched feel wet." And I found myself underlying, I write a lot of my books, FYI. I own a lot of books, I'm allowed to do that. So I found myself underlining these passages about the terrain and your quotes about the place of growing up all over the Pacific Northwest. There's a map floating around somewhere. There's like 60 different places you mentioned in the book around the Pacific Northwest. And I just thought it was so interesting to have that kind of tie to a region and not just one town, but all over.
Right.
Has it influenced you to stay in the Pacific Northwest? Do you think you could ever leave it? And like, what sense of the land and changes do you think maybe you've acquired because of that?
Well, I think that particular line, especially about the river, is like, I really do truly remember feeling that way as a kid, because, you know, when we were with Loyd, again, we always lived in like green, wet forest, you know, like what you expect west of the Cascades. And for me, like a creek or a river was like rushing and clear. And then the Columbia River it's like in the Dalles especially is so wide and huge, but it's like you don't see any current, and everything was brown. And I was like, how does this river not make this place seem wet? Like as a little kid, I was just like, I just don't get it. So definitely once that schism happened, it was such an obvious, like difference in terrain for me. Like my mom then from then on lived in this brown dry place, you know, with where the aluminum plant in the Dalles back then was just pumping along. And you know, and so it was not what I was used to. I was always living in these small timber towns or maybe a mill town with my dad, and this was just such a different feeling. And so it set up this dichotomy between, you know, the two in many ways. I think as far as whether it influenced me to stay in the Northwest, that's a good question. I don't know if I know that about myself. I think what largely has kept me in the Northwest is my family. And because I've definitely thought about trying to, you know, move on. My daughter lives in Chicago right now. She's going to school in Chicago, and I've definitely fallen in love with that city. And I've asked myself, like, why don't you ever leave? But I mean, I think we've got it pretty good here in Oregon. But I did move a little west. I now live where it's much more green. So I'm close to my mom and my sister and you know, they're in the Dalles, but I did move a little west. And it's interesting. I was just thinking about that the other day, that kind of schism, because I really do live right now, like right on the border between, I live on the Cascades, right? And so I didn't go all the way my mom's way or my dad's way. I'm just like somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many great things to love about our state here in Oregon. Okay, so then I just want to touch base on a couple of your themes, and then we'll open up to questions. So primarily poverty and family. So in regards to poverty, so much about this book was about class and the trappings of class and what it means to be, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, like really difficult to climb out of where you are and to see out of where you are. And there were all these passages I read, like the heartache about the Cabbage Patch Kid, like, oh my gosh, I went through the same thing. Like it was just, when you see your friends or people that your peers that you're at school with have all these things that you don't have, it affects you, even though there's something more important that you learn as you grow up about it. So I was just wondering, like, how that background has affected you, what you've learned from writing the book about poverty, and where you think that might take you in your future writing in regards to class.
Yeah, I think it has really been kind of a remarkable experience for me. I think that as I wandered around in this book more and more, I started to realize I just don't feel like I can write about anything but class. And that might change at some point, but for now it's like it's what I'm totally curious about and what I'm spend all my time writing about. Because, you know, and I think again, I think a big part of, for me, whenever we talk about poverty, I'm very reluctant because I don't want to represent anyone but myself and my own experience. And I don't want to say I'm speaking for all people who've lived in poverty or anything of that sort. But I think for me, a big part of that, like I said before, that shame that you carry, it just really, kids who grew up the way I grew up don't have to feel ashamed all the time. I think that's that was a revelation that came to me, is like, they don't have to feel that way. We make them feel that way. And when I say we, I really mostly mean those of us who are not poor. And I think I had an eye-opening experience because there have been times that I have not been the person I wished I was toward my own sibling who's still living in poverty, and how much I sometimes think, oh, you're in need of my advice or my unsolicited advice, you know, or my wisdom, because you're still poor and I'm not. And it's a very easy mindset to fall into, because we are all really trained to think that way, like to think that, oh, that person, because I've seen her have experiences where, like, oh, she cleans somebody's house, right? And then that person thinks, because she cleans my house, like, I can give her this sort of insulting advice all the time, you know, because the fact that she's in that station and I'm in this station means that I have some wisdom to impart to her. And it all goes back to this idea of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's like, well, what about people who just don't even have boots, you know? I mean, or who have generations behind them who didn't have any of the skills to help them understand how to move out of that space, you know? Like, going to college was a mystery to me. I couldn't figure out how anybody possibly did that. Like, I wanted to go to college. I always thought I was going to college. My mom told me I needed to go to college because I was kind of the good student in our house. But when the time actually came, I had no idea how to do it. And I went to a counselor and he was kind of like, oh, you're probably community college material. You know, he pretty much handed me a community college pamphlet. And so that was my path, is through community college. Like, I paid for a class at a time, and, you know, but there's just so many skills we didn't have to help us figure that out. And so I think that was a big part of, like, I just want people to realize, like, not everybody starts at the same place. Not everybody has, you know, you mentioned the women earlier. And I think that's a big part of it for me as well, is that, you know, these women did not have the resources to realize their potential, like that, right? And it's very frustrating to not be able to realize your potential, to only be able to get by day to day, and you don't have a good path, so you're just trying to find whatever is safest for your kids, you know, on any given day. And yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question, but
I think you said so many great things there. I need to go back to all of them. I think it's so important, the more books that we read about this topic and bring awareness to this topic. And I'm sitting here thinking, while you're talking about the book that, I don't know if it was a Pulitzer or the National Book Award, but the Matthew Desmond book, Evicted. And it's all about that cycle of eviction and poverty, and how there really are not the tools sometimes to pull yourself out of that. And it's so important to be aware and find ways to help in any way that we can, or at least acknowledge.
Yeah, and maybe just untangle that idea, that bootstrap idea, and just the shaming that we do. Yeah, like, you know, we lived in a small town, with my mom, and so she was often able to cut rent deals where, like, because she always had this goal of moving us to a certain side of town before my brother was in high school, so that he could go to that high school instead of the schools we'd been in. Yeah. But you know, she would, like, we had a few different situations where a landlord would, like, give her rent we could afford in exchange for some sort of favor, right? Like, she was supposed to do labor for them, or they were allowed to stay with us when they were in town, or whatever. But it always came with them having some sort of power over us in addition to the rent we were paying, you know? And I went to 8 different schools growing up, which isn't a lot compared to a lot of like army brats and stuff, but it's a lot considering that my mom kept us in one town that whole time.
Yeah.
And most kids who live in that town go to 3 schools. They have a primary school, a middle school, and a high school. But those moves were all just because of housing insecurity.
Yep.
And you get kicked out of a place and it puts you in another school district. And now I watch it with my sister, and other families just lie about their address, use somebody else's address or whatever, so that their kids get that stability, and I definitely know that's something I've participated in the middle class. We hoard privilege for our children. We make sure they get into those AP classes. We are constantly kind of hoarding all those paths for our kids, but who is that leaving out? And sometimes maybe, I try to ask myself, okay, Tina, do your kids really deserve this? Maybe this is a space to leave for someone else,
It's so interesting that you're thinking about that right now. And so much of our background about watching our parents raise us, and I could talk forever about the undereducation of kids due to moving around. Like, I know that's a whole nother conversation, but it's something that stuck with me about after reading both your books, just how much poverty affects all these other things in our life, from healthcare to education and housing and everything. It's just something. But you mentioned thinking about your kids now, and in relation to how you were raised. And I think that I have this quote I'm trying to find, I wrote it down. So this was a referral. So I wanted to talk finally about family. And so much of your book is about your family, your father in particular, but also your mother and your siblings. And in so many ways, your book is about women and children, and the lack of child support, the story about the Cabbage Patch, all these things that you experienced growing up as a child, you can look back on now as a mom. And so there was this sentence on page 94 when you said, "When I think of this story now, I can only think of her feelings and how isolated she must have felt in her life, and how sad I am when I can't heal my own children's hurts." Now as a parent, what was it like to write about these things that happened, and that now looking back as a mom, that your mom was going through, and your father too, but did that have an impact on how you're raising your kids now, or how you think about it now?
Yes. So my kids are pretty much, my kids are raised. So that, to be honest, the only reason I had space to write the book and go back to grad school and stuff was because I had to get my kids most of the way done before I could do that. But yeah, I think when I was younger, the ways my dad's influence was definitely there with my kids, with the way that I interact with young children. I can definitely sometimes hear the way he would talk to me, and he had a way of paying singular attention that I recognize in myself sometimes. But I also, mostly what I took from him was I'm going to do the opposite of everything he did, right? I'm going to try to be this perfect parent, which I sometimes regret. I actually, now I'm at a place where I feel like I sheltered my children from some things that I wish I hadn't. And I don't see a lot of my extended family, because it feels like when you're working so hard to get through college and, get a mortgage and all these things, and just be be on your, financially stable, it feels like it feels like you have to kind of leave so much behind. And I regret that. I wish that we didn't ask that assimilation of people when they do sort of try to make their way out of poverty. But I do think that that when my kids were younger, I was just trying to not let them be raised in that same way. And so that was kind of how it impacted my parenting. Whereas now I think I have what I consider a better view of it. You can always see things better from a distance. And so for me, it's about again, teaching them where their family comes from, and sort of that they should be proud of that,
That's great. Such a great answer. I'm going to open this up for questions. We're at about 6:45. Tina, thank you so much for all your really honest answers and for being here with us tonight and having this conversation with me. I appreciate it a lot. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat or just unmute yourself. We're not a huge group here, so you're welcome to just speak up and address Tina. She'd love to hear your voice, I'm sure. Or I'll look for questions. So I see a question down here. What's your next book about?
Good question. I've got a couple projects I've been working on. I've kind of been working on a little essay collection. And then I am working on a book that is about pretty much the same years, but that time with my mom and the Dowells. So it's kind of the other side of the mirror from everything that went on in Rough House, because there's just a whole lot of rich material there that I haven't jumped into.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna mute that real quick, 1 second. How was it writing about your family? Did you get any feedback from your family about Rough House? And you're not scared to do another one, I hear.
I have family on this call. So I think that in large part, it was a little easier to put this book in the world first because Loyd is dead. But I did have my mom and my brother, before I considered publication, they got to take a look at that. They read the book and decided whether they were comfortable with it. And, so they were both like totally fine. But in the years leading up to it, I feel like my mom was a little nervous. Like I remember a time I took her, because I knew she was nervous, I took her to a Kim Stafford reading. He had a book out about his brother's suicide called 100 Tricks Every Boy Can Do. And I remembered him telling me that process had made his mom really anxious. And so my mom came to that reading, and then at the end, when he opened up to questions, she asked him, like, how did your mom feel about you writing this book? But I think by the time we got there, it's a long process, and we talked about it a lot. And then, of course, I 100% meant that, like, this won't see the light of day if you guys aren't comfortable. So, I just kind of made sure I had their blessing first.
Yeah.
But in large part, I think it's been great. I think it's made my family closer, maybe, and like made us feel a sense of, like I said, pride that wasn't there before. Things that we felt needed to be hidden don't need to be hidden. And not only that, but they're sort of things that can sort of bring us a lot of joy or pride.
Yeah. And talk about. I'm going to read the next question to you. Nicole Kelm, I know you personally and have heard you tell many of these stories before, yet when I read your book, I felt like I was kind of reading your diary. Have you felt vulnerable putting your story out there, and have you had any insecurities since it was released, knowing people are reading it?
It's funny because I'm glad you say it sounds like a diary, but it's nothing like a diary. And like every sentence in it has been poured over. And it is like, I know, Abby, you're probably getting tired of hearing me say this because you're at every event, but it is a made thing. It is something I made. And like Nicole will get this. Nicole's an artist, right? It's something I made. And yes, what people think of it, I worry about that. But mostly what I worry about is what people like my mom or people like my cousins or my aunts or my family, because they were all like it, because it kind of exposes them. And then second to that is people who have lived that way. And those are people that I really worry about. And those are like my favorite feedback, is getting emails from people who are like, I feel like this has given me permission to write about my life. And, that's huge. But no, I think, Nicole, because it's something I worked on for so long. And once I made the decision to write it, even I know there's a point in the book that sounds unsure, but that was on purpose, right? Because I'm trying to show how I processed that trauma and what that was like for me then. But it doesn't scare me for people to read it now. Like I have work colleagues reading it.
It's out there now.
I got an email from somebody just today that was like, by the way, like it was this long email, and then at the end she wrote, by the way, it was a good choice to write the worst thing. Because in that chapter, the narrator, Tina, which is a different person from me, is like, I considered not telling you this part, you know, and it kind of shows that anxiety because we hold those secrets so close, you know, but there's just such freedom in letting them go.
Yeah. Incredible. Okay, next question comes from Lydia. One of the biggest pieces of writing advice is kill your darlings. And I know that you worked really hard cutting pieces that didn't work. How did you decide which pieces worked and which didn't?
I don't know. I still know. A large part was you. You helped me decide some of those. No, I really did have some I couldn't count on like my mom or my really close friends that outside of writing to help with that, because they're just like, it's all great, keep it, you know. So I had early readers in my community like Abby who were just like, it's all great, I want more. But writing people like Lydia and like, you know, Keenan Norris obviously was a big one too, who would just be like, you got to cut this, you got to cut this. So that was helpful. But also I tend to be a very savage reviser just naturally. Like I cut and cut and cut, sometimes probably to a fault. And, you know, I had this idea that I wanted a 250-page memoir. I wanted it to land around 250 pages or less. I like a slim memoir. I don't know why. That was just something I decided. So I just kept hacking until I got there. And then of course it's a tall book, so it ended up being a lot shorter than like the manuscript I turned in was around 250 pages. But yeah, so I don't know. I think it's an intuitive process. But the darlings is definitely part of it. And there were parts where I was like, this just sounds too cute. It's gotta go. You know, it's gotta go. I'm sorry, but that's my adorable niece. Hi, Mia. Hi, Ella. Hi. Anyway, so yeah, it was largely, you know, you recognize those sort of swampy, sweet moments where you're just like, no, that's gotta go. That's too perfect, you know, like get that out of there.
Right. It must be really hard to go through and cut parts out of your life that you want to include. That's pretty savage, Tina.
For some reason, it's not hard for me. Like I'm a cutter. I just cut them. Yeah. I just love cutting them.
Okay, I'm going to give you another minute if you want to ask any other final questions. It's been so great to see you, Tina, and to have a conversation with you tonight. And look at those littles.
I know. She's my favorite thing in the whole world. So I'm sorry I'm distracted.
She's really cute. She deserves it. Well, we videotaped the conversation, so we'll share it on our YouTube channel within a week or so and send you that link. Oh, we're getting all of them now.
Sherry.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for coming out. Thanks for visiting. Thanks for the conversation, Tina. This was really wonderful. You can buy the book at Roundabout Books or your own independent local bookstore. And we really appreciate the time, Tina.
Thank you, Cassie.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Love you, Mom. Love you, Sherry. Bye, Ella.
Ella. Hi, Missy.
Thank you, guys.
You're going, yeah.
Thank you, Cassie. That was great. Your questions are amazing.
Well, I diverted a little bit off of where we talked about, but it mostly got in there. So we're
You were
good.
perfect.
I love that you brought up the Cabbage Patch part. I've asked her to read from that before.
Oh my gosh. It was
she
like
never
reading
did
my
it.
own life. The Cabbage
know.
Patch was such a big deal.
I know.
Hi, Ellen. You know, you guys, the reason I never read it is I've timed it and it's really long for a Zoom reading.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Well, read the book.
All right, I'll accept it.
Abby, I will read it to you in person.
Thank you. I'm glad Sherry, I hope Sherry can hear. Can you hear, Sherry? I worry that she never got to be able to hear it.
I think she can because I said I loved her and she said she loved me back.
Oh, I tried to like ask to unmute, but I don't know if it worked. Hi, Curtis.
Fantastic.
Oh, yes,
Cassie
I
and-
can
and
hear. My
Tina.
mic was off.
Hi, Curtis.
I've heard all but one, I think, and of these, and that was really terrific. I mean, Cassie, you really took it to some different places.
Wow, thank you. That's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
nice compliment. Thank you.
Well, you know the book. You drew some.
Well, I
it's-
enjoyed.
Yeah.
Thanks, Curtis.
Okay,
I
well, thank
enjoyed the book.
Thank you for doing this.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Bye.
Hi, Curtis.
Bye, Tina. Thank you. See you soon. Oh, I got the books today. Thanks.
Oh, good. Did you
Yeah,
get
yeah.
your face mask?
I just saw the books. I haven't really opened it. Oh, did you give me a
Okay,
face
there's a-
mask?
Well, there's a present in there that I forgot to put in your gift that I sent you.
Oh.
And it's handmade by one of my students.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. I'll definitely use it. Thank you so much. Okay, bye.
All right,
Bye.
bye, everybody.
I'll see you at your mom's book club.
Have a great night.
Thanks, Cassie, for hosting a little informal family reunion there.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I'm glad you guys all got to see each other.
I see my niece at least once a week, but I just can't get enough of her.
Enjoy your time off, Tina, a little bit.
Thank
We'll
you. Good night, you guys. Bye, Sherry. Love you.